welcome to another episode of Money for Nothing, the podcast about music and capitalism. I'm Saxon Baird with Sam Backer. As always, today we are talking the BMI, also known as Broadcast Music Incorporated, the massive performance rights organization, has gone private. Is got sold for, or is currently in the process of being sold.
In the process of being sold.
For,
Q1, it seems like the
$1.7 billion to the anonymous investment group called New Mountain Capital. And people are like, yo, what the fuck? Because BMI has essentially operated as like a nonprofit organization for the better part of 80 years.
Yeah.
And is the very source of income for songwriters when it comes to
like half the songwriters.
like half the songwriters.
Like half the songwriters.
Yeah, basically. Yeah. I think in 20, just to give you like a number, but in 2022 BMI collected 1.5 billion in revenue and distributed 1.47 in royalties. They include over 1.4 million songwriters and 22.4 million compositions. Anyway, so it's a big fucking deal, and I think a lot of people are really concerned about what it means that this very important integral part of the music industry and getting songwriters paid that has acted like a nonprofit for 80 years is suddenly going private and like going to have investors and like try to turn a profit and already ASCAP, its big
Crosstown
rival is posting things like private equity never wrote a love song or something like that.
Yo, I love like ASCAP. The idea of like ASCAP going on social media and dropping heat is really, I mean, I guess it's where we're at in corporate America, but like it's so ludicrous.
It's really ridiculous. Like ASCAP, we pay songwriters, not shareholders. ASCAP, not for profits. It's 1914. Anyways, so we're like, this is a huge fucking deal. It's like right into the money for nothing slot. And but we want to go ahead and just like first like like remind everyone like a little bit like what the fuck BMI was and is and its history, and then like kind of like try to figure out like what this actually means for the music industry like near future. Like right now we can look into our money for nothing crystal ball a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, no, this is so weird, and like it's so weird because I feel like BMI and ASCAP, the performing rights organizations, are so weird. And when the news broke about a year and a half ago that ASCAP was moving from a non-profit to a profit model, I think the general response was like, they can do that? Like that's a thing that exists.
Yeah, it feels like it's like this is like breaking some law, but
no, and it's breaking. Here's the thing. I think that's it's breaking something, and it's breaking like the very specific, incredibly jury-rigged set of institutions that like hold together the ramshackle nature of the modern music economy. It's like a bad plumbing system, like a really bad plumbing system.
Are you trying to say that like the Harry Fox agency is like
it's like a bad plumbing system, but it's like it was ostensibly a plumbing system, and now it's like part of the plumbing system is like no, our job is to put water through us, but also to turn a shareholder profit, which is like, Sir, you're a pipe. Like, you don't, that's not, but as you're saying, it breaks like implicit norms, but not apparently laws or the consent decrees that actually structure all of this. So, Yeah. So really quickly, just like and we've covered this once before in an episode called, I believe, "What Are Consent Decrees?" So we'll post that in the show notes, and not redo this history that much. But basically, both ASCAP and BMI are organizations that collect performance royalties for songwriters, for publishing rights, which different than, the two general bundles of copyrights. You've got one set of copyrights around recordings, the actual sound recordings, one set of copyrights around the intellectual property behind those recordings. That's the music and the lyrics. Those are triggered in different ways. And ASCAP and BMI emerge from a moment when public performances of music are a central element driving the musical economy. So we're talking like teens, 20s here. And basically a bunch of composers were like, our songs are making people a lot of money. They're driving like the New York nightlife and we're not getting paid a cent for them because a band leader will buy the piece of sheet music, right? That's great. We get paid on that. But then, this is a moment when like classic smoke-filled nightclubs are appearing in New York for the first time. And they're like the composers are like walking along Broadway and being like, that restaurant and that restaurant and that restaurant and that restaurant all seem like they're making money. And they're all making money because people go there to listen to our songs. And we're not making any money from any of that. So they form ASCAP to try to deal with that. There's a bunch of legal battles where basically because if you think about it, it's a weird set of like, it breaks a lot of like the relationships that kind of like unions in that like it's very hard to negotiate one-on-one. And so what is supposed to be a free market system, you actually do need collective bargaining of certain kinds in order to make this work. And ASCAP was very much doing that. And the question is like, is this illegal? Is this like a cartel? And eventually it gets decided by the Supreme Court that no, this is legal. And that ASCAP is allowed to shake down restaurateurs, which they do really happily and often in fairly corrupt ways for a while. And like the stories of ASCAP in the 20s and 30s are hilarious because they like show up and they're like, you played 6 of our songs. And the restaurateur's like, which ones? And ASCAP's like, we don't have to tell you that, but you have to give us money. And like this funny like combination of like Jewish vaudeville songwriters and goons is like the ASCAP way and has remained the ASCAP way more or less ever since. And then like tech happens, as it so often does in our world. And the first crazy tech to happen was, ready for this, Saxon? The talkies.
Ooh.
Which,
disrupting
like, again,
the industry. Talkies.
Disrupting the industry, the talkies. But, like, if you think about the talkies, sound films, as is so often true with new technologies, the killer app of sound film is music, right? The first big talkie is called The Jazz Singer, which is it's about a rabbi's son pretending to be black so he can be American. It's a really weird film.
Wild.
Which is like
canceled.
A really weird film which is canceled. And like a whole other conversation for a whole other day. But
not on this episode. Not on this podcast.
Not on this podcast. But is actually, I think, not even sound all the way through. There's silent chunks, and then there's sound for the songs. And that's huge. And then movie musicals are like driving the musical economy because the relationship between Broadway and pop song goes it's like hand in hand for the early part of the 20th century. And so movie theaters are the next big ASCAP shakedown. And again, you get these big kind of intersectoral negotiations between the publishers and the songwriters and the movie theaters where publishers and songwriters are kind of demanding like a per seat percentage of the overall costs, like right. So they're saying like, you owe us 4 cents for every movie theater seat or something like that. Really big demands. And basically the Hollywood is like, yeah, sure. And then just buys all of Tin Pan Alley, which is actually, and this is another kind of aside, but like heavy echoes of like Amazon Studios, right? Or like the way that the way that Netflix rolled out stuff, where they blew up by being a channel for other people's content, and then eventually are like, oh, we've got to vertically integrate because that's the only way to have control of our product. And actually, you don't need to fully vertically integrate. And this is like, I think like the key. Like you just need to own some of it enough that you can use that as leverage to push down the prices everywhere else. So what you have is ASCAP and Hollywood and all that together. And then we've got the next big disruptive technology. It's radio. It's radio.
The radio. It's the radio. Yeah, I figured.
Which actually, like, it's crazy. Like, radio almost kills records for a hot second. Like, it's cheaper. You get endless music.
I just listen to NTS. I don't buy records anymore. I just listen to NTS. Maybe it killed my record collection.
I mean, right. And that was internet radio. Imagine the real thing. No, but like, so you get radio, which also it's the kind of the streaming app of its day, right? For a low price, you get infinite music. You don't have control over it, but you get infinite music.
Honestly, thank God. I like that I can relinquish control to some DJ in a converted shipping container in London. That's the way I roll now.
It's just listening to shipping containers in London.
Oh yeah, that too. Yeah, that too. Yeah. But no, preferably DJs in London doing this or elsewhere. Yeah. Anyways.
Big up the London massive.
Big up NTS with its private equity investment.
Yeah. We got our eyes on you, pal. Right. So radio blows up. You get massive networks. And again, this is all like, thinking about this is industries. Like NBC is also like, and ABC are also making all the radios, right? They're these huge corporations.
Oh yeah, that's right. I think we mentioned this in previous.
They're huge corporations that are constructing stuff, making records, making radio players. Like they're vertically integrated, enormous, multinationals.
Can't wait for the Spotify phone.
They called that an iPod, actually, and it was sick. And so you get basically this massive conflict more or less between two industries. The connection between ASCAP and Hollywood is a little bit more diffuse than the connection between the radio stations and what turns into BMI. But basically, ASCAP starts doing their same thing to the radio stations and saying, we give us X amount of money per play. And none of this is really governed. This is pre-consent decree. None of it's really organized. And you get this huge set of battles, basically. These like rate negotiation battles about how much every single radio play they're gonna pay out to ASCAP. And it gets really ugly. In fact, ASCAP at one point, as like a negotiating tactic, pulls the license. So all ASCAP compositions are no longer allowed to be played on the radio, which means that they go to
live bands, right?
No. But it doesn't matter if it's live or not.
Oh, that's right.
It can't be an ASCAP composition. So they just play like "Mary Had a Little Lamb" a lot, like anything in the public domain, like they're scrambling.
It's an experimental art
piece. You do get
piece.
like big band versions of "Mary Had a Little Lamb" because like they need something.
Could be dope.
But yeah, so you get these back and forth negotiations, and eventually the radio networks realize like they need their own thing to like. And they need their own performing rights organization so they can stop dealing with these assholes at ASCAP. And so they start BMI, basically. Like they say they don't like exactly 100%, like, but they do. Like they 100% start BMI. And you get more complicated dynamics we're not getting into for the sake of this episode. But like ASCAP's an old boys club. It's got a really opaque structure, which we will get into a little bit in this episode, maybe. But basically, like, it's founded by these songwriters, and how much all the different songwriters get paid out of a central pot is determined by, like, how much cultural value ASCAP thinks they all provide, not like how many songs are being sold. Partially because they don't have the
which
metrics
turns
on that.
out surprisingly to be classist and racist.
Yeah, and like classist and racist, and like the set of Tin Pan Alley composers who started ASCAP are determined to be the most valuable cultural assets by the ASCAP board, which they comprise.
They started. Interesting. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, sure. Seems fair.
Yeah, it's 100% fair.
Yeah.
BMI, in a search for music, basically, I mean, I think this is a little bit overstated, but they do look to a lot of kinds of music that ASCAP hadn't been willing to license. So a lot of country guys end up on BMI. A lot of black performers are able to license stuff through BMI. And so there's, arguments about the ways that fight ended up democratizing music. But still, it's corporate chicanery all the way down. It's like,
yeah, like the important point here is that like BMI to this day, I mean, I guess it's just getting sold, but like to this day is owned by a network of radio broadcasters.
Partially owned, or related
which
to.
They're then, which those radio broadcasters are the ones that are then paying back into BMI, who then pays the songwriters.
Yeah. Yes.
Capitalism is fucking wild, dude.
Well, it's capitalism, and like it's also just the ways in which like this is like a fascinating story of why like neoliberalism is an ideology and an ideological fantasy, because like capitalism requires these weird systems, like the music industry, especially in the mid 20th century, like given the ability to collect data, needed these weird systems to move money around. But it's not like it's not an open market. It's impossible for it to be an open market. And then it's, of course, like once everyone gets their cut of the pie, and everyone uses and manipulates their position within those structures for their own advantage. But like, it's a weird system of pipes, as we've been saying, that like structures all of this. And that's before the government gets involved with the consent decrees, which BMI signs first, I believe. And basically the government is like, you guys can't, there needs to be something resembling, and this is really in some ways where they get their legitimacy from for the second part of the 20th century. The government's like, there need to be some sort of rules vaguely. And they both signed consent decrees with the government that set up a set of rules that they're always trying to like renegotiate and fight about. That kind of makes these, and this is kind of the crucial thing for the rest of the conversation. The government consent decrees, which are usually given to companies when they're being very, very bad, which, like, to reiterate, these companies they were being very, very bad companies. But like, gives them this stamp of approval. Like, this is going to be the structure of copyright royalty flows in the United States. And that these are at some level, in this weird level that it created over time. The consent decrees went from like, you're bad and this is a punishment, to like the government setting up a system that really couldn't hold by any other means. And that kind of crystallizes the configuration as it was set up at that moment, and then kind of that carries on forward. And they're still they're some of the oldest consent decrees in the country. They're from I think like the late 40s, early 50s.
And just to be clear, a consent decree is basically the government basically being like, we don't want to make a law about this, just do it or else we'll come down on your ass. It's like a simple way of saying it.
Yeah, and saying like, you're clearly in violation of like all of these like various kinds of like usually like antitrust rules, because like they're trusts like explicitly, but the government being like, but actually if we get rid of the trusts it's worse, so we're gonna have these. It ends up being like a weird special license, like we're gonna license these two trusts to behave under certain sets of rules because the free market doesn't make that idea doesn't make any sense in this set of circumstances.
Yeah, but I think that the consent decree is, and the license is essentially that they have to offer like a blanket license.
They have to offer so people, everyone can.
So they can't be like, yeah, so they can't be like, Duke Ellington costs 50, but like Woody Guthrie costs 20.
And they have to allow people to license with them. There's stuff about rates. I mean, it's a whole nest of specificities.
And BMI has like
make it a vaguely fair playing field. Vaguely. Right. While still, and this is important, and kind of as we think through like what this privatization of sale means, while still like ensconcing these weird semi-state, non-profit, semi-corporate actors as like the neutral arbiters and structures, but like without actually like they're not neutral. Like there's no fair here. There are these two organizations that are competitive with each other, that are run by ? That are kind of connected to ? Interests, that like certainly through like the discussion of like BMI's relationship to the radio companies and like ASCAP's relationship to the original Tin Pan Alley publishers, like certain people are able to use their positions within these organizations to gain power and to pull money out in all the unfair ways that the music industry likes to move money around. And so there's this weird thing. It's like, I don't even know what it's like. It's like if the National Milk Council started selling cows. I don't know. It's so weird. It's such a weird system. And it's so weird that they were allowed to go private.
And that's where we are now, being sold under BMI's CEO Mike O'Neill's leadership, being sold for $1.7 billion to, like I said, New Mountain Investors, or whatever the fuck it's called. Who cares? And of course, like that brings up a lot of questions about all the things that we've just discussed, which is who benefits, who gets the money, what's the motivation. Who fucking knows? Like, and like, honestly, like we don't really have a lot of answers yet. And so some of the questions put forth by a number of songwriting alliances and organizations, Artists' Rights Alliance, the Black Music Action Coalition, Music Artists Coalition, Songwriters in North America, SAG-AFTRA, they wrote like a joint letter basically with a number of concerns. And of course, like, I think it's...
Fuck yeah, SAG-AFTRA.
Yeah.
Get it, guys.
Hell yeah, get it. Yeah, so they put forth like a number of concerns, which... I think are pretty obvious in what we're describing right now, which is like, who gets the money of the sale? What happens to the representation of like the songwriters if the company is now based around making a profit and has investors who are expecting a return on those investments? Like, wait a minute, what? Like, how the fuck
will our rates be changed?
And so what we have seen is, I think we should also mention that Google's involved, or Alphabet, as we should say, which is also kind of like a strange also addition to this. Which
they're a minority stakeholder now, so we don't know exactly how much.
So we don't really have answers to any of these questions because we don't know. But one thing we did that has come out, which is kind of interesting, is that already BMI has put forth that they're actually increasing the cut that they take from collecting these royalties and then distributing them out. So they normally take like 10% cut, and they've actually upped it to 15%, which is like, doesn't seem like a lot, but that's
well, I mean, the songwriters have been getting too fat for too long.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
I mean, as any songwriter will tell you, they're just, look, I'm so angry. Bro. These songwriters, they come in, they buy up brownstones, they gentrify neighborhoods. They like
all these
just with their songwriting money,
$9
acoustic
lattes,
guitars. Yeah, their $9 lattes and their $9,000 Martin acoustic guitars, just ruining neighborhoods left and right. I mean, what they did to San Francisco is a travesty.
Clearly, the songwriters are to blame for that. If you do not have a good litmus test for sarcasm, you just that was all sarcasm. But yeah. And so we're like here this right now, this episode, and we're kind of like, I mean, obviously, I think it goes without saying, we're like, this probably isn't a good thing. But also, like, we also don't want to suggest that like BMI was some like saintly organization that was benevolently like passing money on to these greedy songwriters, as we've been talking about. But you know, it has a shady history as well, as we just illustrated. But yeah, but it is interesting. It just doesn't seem like this isn't a better turn.
It's like, it's the weirdest. It's one of the like, I didn't have it on my music industry bingo card. It's a very weird set of events. I mean, I do think it's maybe worth puzzling out a little bit, like the going for profit to going private pipeline.
Yeah.
Right. But also think about the timing on this. As we've covered extensively, and as I am really, really looking forward to covering again, a set of big finance capital had poured into songwriting for the last several years, and currently isn't doing as well as it once did.
Hypnosis.
Hypnosis, yeah. Which we're looking forward to as a future episode. But for anyone who hasn't paid attention, is that Hypnosis Funds is really having a lot of trouble. And as people who have like had to read a lot of bullshit press releases over the past several years, like, we're loving it. We told you so, and we love it.
Turns out those press releases are bullshit. Yeah, it turns out those press releases are complete bullshit. As yeah, you should always read them with your bullshit meter going. But
you actually have to turn down the sensitivity though on some of those, because like otherwise it just runs into the red the whole time, and you get bullshit distortion, which doesn't sound good. But thinking about the timeline here for a second, they go for profit in this moment of like financialized interest in songwriters, where it's also in like about a year and change ago. So I assume that like the mechanisms and wheels and plots and plans started going earlier, which means that like this seems like a decision that was made in what I would term the frothy times of like, this is like a 2020 ass decision. It seems like, where there's a lot of weird money and there's a lot of like everything's going online all at once, and so the decision was made there that like it's possible to my gut, and again this is like this is just from my like reading of the situation, is like it seemed like there was so much money pouring into this space that going private going for profit was a way to tap into more of it, without like that the pie was growing so big that no one would notice you were getting a bigger cut of it, basically, and that they could make moves to maybe, and this might get into legal areas, I don't know, whether there's certain kinds of investments that they could get to. And I think they actually claim this is like they were able to tap into sources of funding by being a for-profit company that they were unable to get to as a nonprofit.
But the question,
unfortunately, like,
well, the question still remains though, like what, how does that benefit songwriters in like any fucking way? If the only way that the songwriters are making money is like through these royalties, through like, you know, performance rights. Like,
no, that's a really good question. I'm struggling to think of like, let's take it for just a second seriously. Like, is there any way that we can think of where actually them going for profit could even at any level plausibly help the songwriters? And like, maybe it's spinning up.
See, for me, it's like, I think the one reading through the bullshit of Mike O'Neill, the CEO, and his like what he's saying, for me, like the only thing that I could really like logically conclude was that this whole thing about how there's so many more musical touch points, that perhaps in some way BMI invests into one of these like newer musical touch points, and possibly even kind of like creating their own that would allow more plays for these songwriters, you know. But like, yeah,
that's smart. No, you're right, Saxon. That's exactly it. It's saying that BMI could enter into the brave new world of basically like music tech, and that somehow that it would, by basically being a player that had this collection of rights that were attached to it, though. Like, it is important, and in like a particularly damning one of those questions from these songwriters associations, they're like, it seems like you're making money with rights that like you don't own. Like, you own the right to license some of these rights in specific ways, but like BMI doesn't hold the copyrights to those songs. It's just collecting and licensing copyrights for other people, and it's like, seems like it's behaving like it has ownership over stuff it doesn't. But I think you're exactly right that like the plan was to, I mean, maybe a little bit like the model of the payout that the record companies got from Spotify when it went public, right? That the record companies got a chunk when they originally, the major labels, when they originally licensed their masters to Spotify. They got a huge payout basically for free that went just to the companies. Now, like, that then, for that to actually help songwriters, you have to assume that the for-profit company would then fairly distribute any money it made from these kind of maneuvers to the songwriters, which, like, as a CEO, I guess you could claim, but like, my understanding of the history of capitalism is like, that seems unlikely.
Yeah, I mean, there were some instances which I don't actually have in front of me of like this kind of thing happening with like Sony and like other companies, music companies, where they, you know, earned some massive profit through some sort of like merger or whatever, and like some of them did distribute it out to like the artists and some didn't, and all this stuff. But like, I think
just to touch on that though, that's true, and that's a good point. And as you'll hear, as part of the sale, these companies are doing some of that. And like, again, like the cynic asks, is A, which artists are getting that money? B, how are they distributed? Because like, as we know, and as you can see again from that initial history of ASCAP, right? Like, big players in the industry themselves become like mini businesses, right? Like, if you're getting $100 million and you're giving some of it to a chunk of it to Madonna because she's like a major subcontractor for you, it's different than like the artists in general. But I think that's a really good point that there were some distributions of money from these big sales, but like, no one thinks that like, out of the goodness of their heart, these companies are distributing this cash flow fairly.
No, of course not.
Or like, they're not getting a bigger cut. Like,
right.
of course not.
Right. But actually, I want to go back to a point though you're mentioning though about how one of the main concerns by the songwriters was that, you know, you seem to be making a profit off of what you don't own. But actually, it's like, if you think about the valuation of the company, like, how did they get to like $1.4 billion, $1.7 billion price tag? And I think it goes back to what you're saying, where it's like, they're not valued at $1.7 billion because they distribute royalties. It's because of like the roster that they have of people, right? It has to be that. Like, why? Like you're not like buying up this company because of their like ability to like distribute royalties. That doesn't like earn you 1 point. It's because like Taylor Swift's on their roster, right? It has to be things like that. And it's almost like, for me, maybe this is a related point, maybe not, but it like, just tangentially going to it, in you talking about that, I was thinking like, in one way, it almost like feels like they're trying to play like UMG a little bit, where they're like trying to like, we have this and we have that, we have a record label, we have a publishing, you know, like we're like, and kind of have their tentacles in like various parts of the industry. But on the other hand, they also feel like they're trying to play like Hypnosis, except for the difference is that like Hypnosis was actually buying these catalogs and actually had ownership over them. But like BMI doesn't actually own these like whatever I don't want to say catalogs, but like own these like contracts that they have with these songwriters. They don't own the music, so
they
it's
don't
like,
own the music. They own the contracts.
But that's playing. So yeah, they own the contract. So that's playing into the valuation of it, right? But it's interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting thing, and it's like, but then so that's why you get back to this point of like, who like is going to make the profit? Because like Neil Young could sell half his catalog to Hypnosis and then reinvest in Hypnosis and like make money off of it. And it's like, is that going to be the case here? I mean, like, I don't know, like, how does that work here? Like, I guess it's minus the sale.
I mean, there's two ways. There's two ways to think about it, right? Like, I think that's a really good set of questions. One is that they think and I do not think this is the case, but one answer is they think that buying this and then having it for a long time, and you can make some changes to squeeze some stuff and get a steady revenue flow from these, that this is a long-term good investment, right? That the general trend, and this is true, Hypnosis was, give the devil his due, right about this, that like the overall payouts for publishing have increased, and saying like, thinking about this as like not a right now play, but like a in 50 years play. Like, we bought this now, it will be worth more in the future, and like we can just get a steady revenue stream the whole time. That's one play. Though I don't think that that's like a
major motivation. Yeah,
that's like, that just seems like way too Warren Buffett-y for like anyone involved in the music industry. And that's because the music industry is filled with like, is in some ways the reason that Warren Buffett doesn't invest in record labels is that the music industry is filled with chicanery. It's the reason that anyone can make profit is because they're like skimming. I'm increasingly convinced is like the skimming is essential and the opacity is essential, which means that like if that ever broke, these may not be, the sustainability of the business models are a little bit up for grabs, which means that like in order to make a long play investment, you need to be like certain that like there won't be insane volatility or like a congressional investigation that's going to tar you and feather you, or like a celebrity doing something horrible that then you have to deal with, or like any of the numerous things that like constantly defines the history of popular music. You need to be like, none of that's going to happen, and this will be a nice stable investment, like, I don't know, a lumber company. And like it's just not. And so it tends to be like, when they get big money, it tends to be like weird fast money, like bubble stuff. Like, and that I think leads to the second reason why it has this valuation, which is kind of where I think a lot of stuff in the music industry is pointing to right now. And I think the touch points you mentioned is part of it. But it's like, there's gonna be a lot of IP licensing. I mean, there already is, and there's gonna be a lot more IP licensing in a lot more ways.
Yeah.
There's going to be, like, just with tech that, like, currently actually works, like, I take that back because it doesn't work. Like, metaverse stuff, I think, is going to happen, not via Meta, but, like, via Fortnite, right? Like, these spaces, online spaces in which people experience music, are only going to grow, and there's complex licensing, and there's complex sync, and just having, like, already set an enormous, like, half of the relationships with half of the IP producers in like set ways, and legal precedents for blanket licensing and like negotiations with the government make it might be really valuable in a lot of different settings, especially if the federal government at some point, let's say in 10 years, looks at, and this is like the real like crown jewel, like looks at AI music IP licensing stuff and needs a blanket license because who knows what that training data is. So in some ways, a blanket license is the only way to do it. And the federal government is like, oh, we could make a new set of organizations, or we already have consent decrees with the IP, with these two performing rights organizations that deal with much of the IP related to the performance of this material. And who's to say that, like, at some level, what a large language model is doing when it's like chattering to itself isn't a performance at some level, if the only audience is the next like level of Transformers. I mean, let's be real here. When you press play on Spotify, and there's some precedent for this, when you press play on a track on Spotify, because of my understanding is because of buffering, it's technically both a performance of the song and making a copy of the song. And so it triggers multiple kinds of copyright. So like there's been a precedent for the creative application of and especially given like how hard it is to get laws through Congress, creative application of existing copyright structures and existing structures within the music industry in order to like slap another layer of duct tape on this set of pipes and like keep it going because making a new one is too complicated.
Oh yeah, like I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, the point that this is a really great point that these so-called quote unquote musical touch points are only going to continue to fall into further and further gray areas around like which licensing royalty they're triggering. And yeah, you're going to need either new laws or you're going to have to like you said, slap some duct tape on it. And like, I guess having the funding to to be able to, I guess, that determines the valuation. That determines the valuation of like BMI.
I think that's the thing,
sure.
Is that people are like this. The odds of this being the odds of BMI being an influential player in the next iteration of the music rights holding landscape, if you were gonna bet on like right, it's not the worst bet actually that like BMI is going to continue to matter in some capacity. And then you start saying, if you're Alphabet and you're training data, right? You need training data. You've not just need training data. If you are, and let's make this like crystal clear. If you are any AI company in which you have just so happened to already have participated in what is probably the single largest act of copyright violation in the history of copyright. Okay, so there was this period of time for about a century where the US didn't respect any European copyrights. So that was also a pretty big copyright violation. But like in terms of depending on how you say what an instance of copyright violation is, like the number of interactions with copyrighted materials that, let's say, ChatGPT does, even if it isn't allowed to reproduce it, like it did in its training. So like all of these companies are going to have to deal with the fact that they've suddenly made billions of dollars with other people's data. And like, if you're Google, like having, and this is quoting a Chris Castle article, who's a really good observer a lot of this stuff, and now you potentially have a seat on the board, a non-voting seat, but as a major investor, like a seat on the board, these tech companies have a lot of money. That might very well be worth the price of admission.
Yeah, no, like those are great points. Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think that kind of unlocks like the reason why like Google is even, or Alphabet or whatever the fuck you want to call it, like is even involved in this situation. Like definitely, like it's clearly got to be an AI thing, and obviously the continuing ways in which new musical touch points and AI are falling into gray areas around these discussions of copyright, and also just fucking how slow the government is in like responding to it or even understanding it. And so of course this policy is going to be shaped and understood, or lack of policy is going to be like shaped by companies like BMI and Alphabet.
And I also just think that it's important to think about the ways in which, and I haven't quite thought this through totally yet, but like the ways in which these new technologies aren't just going to like plop in the middle of like a undeveloped field that was stolen from someone, but like plopped in the middle of the thriving city that is now the internet that was also stolen from someone. I just assume that like all the internet was expropriated land. That like YouTube like is also a place where originally a massive act of copyright infringement that now is a major payer into the music industry, and into songwriting, publishing, and like that AI is going to be like AI productions, however they end up functioning, are gonna be channeled through something like YouTube, which also is Alphabet.
Yeah, it's taking care of a headache before it happens. Basically, it's like look, it's or trying to.
Table.
Yeah, exactly. Which like having maybe seen the issues it's run into, like these companies have run into in the past involving issues around copyright, like you say, like you just illustrated with YouTube. It's like, well, how do we just like, yeah, how do we head it off for the past, basically? And that definitely could be like another motivation there. And like so maybe to like kind of get into the last part of this episode, I did want to bring up the question around the contracts that the BMI has with its songwriters, because it does have an open door policy. And I think that like Tim Ingram, bless this man's heart for writing all wonderful things at Music Business Worldwide, that this show would be so much less without. He wrote in like many of his articles, he was kind of like speculating on like what this could mean for BMI. And I thought the one really interesting thing that he brought up was about this open door policy that BMI has. So essentially like anyone can join BMI. There's no like filtering system or whatever. But that just curious if like that would remain, and like whether or not like BMI would continue to allow this open door policy, or maybe it might start to limit the number of songwriters. And one thing he brought up was, of course, the stat that gets repeated all the time, which is that like 2.2% of all artists on Spotify generate 95% of all the revenue. And he was actually even saying that at this point, like maybe like songwriters that amateur artists, songwriters that generate like basically no profit whatsoever BMI, that actually, and maybe in a sense like the administration that goes into even having these contracts with these like completely unknown non-profit, like making no profit like songwriters, actually is like costing more than it's worth. And like I don't know, I was just thinking about this, and like I was just thinking like the ways in which like maybe there would be either BMI would cut a lot of its songwriters or require like a certain like level of amount of streams or success, or maybe there would be like they would kind of change the pay structure. And then I was just thinking about this like before this episode, and how that could possibly, if that would possibly be the case. And I was just curious like what your thoughts on that would be.
I guess my thing with that would be, I've got a lot of concerns clearly about the sale and about kind of what could be done about it, in that just like, these structures are not set up to be fair, but people have almost like barnacles, like built lives around them and found ways to make productive niches for themselves in relationship to them. And clearly like situations where they go from bad to worse, bad to allegedly worse. Let's protect ourselves. Like what you can do about that, especially as like the major power players of the industry are girding up for whatever comes next. It strikes me that particular fear of, like, I could imagine maybe tiered contracts, but I guess the thing about it is that like the thing about BMI is that as much as it costs to administer all these contracts, I wonder legally whether they could stop. B,
because of the consent decree.
Yeah, consent decree. I don't know. But B, I actually think that it's very hard to know who is gonna end up, especially in the kind of more grindy world of songwriting, who is gonna end up being a really big moneymaker. And I think a lot of people, especially less musical artists, but like songwriters, like if you're like, you want to be a professional songwriter, like you get that you get a relationship with BMI when you're 17 and 16 and first writing songs and first making the steps in the music industry. And like it could be a decade, plausibly, easily a decade. And this wouldn't be crazy at all that after a decade of like grinding it out and not really having any big hits and not really making any money, that like all of a sudden you make the right connection and then all of us, your songs become enormous. Like that's not a unusual story in the world of songwriting. And it does strike me that like pissing off all of those people, like it's in BMI and ASCAP's interest for people to be like, oh yeah, BMI, like the lawyer answered the phone for me when I was 17, and now I'm writing for Garth Brooks, and like they've got my back still, and like the amount of additional money it would take to do anything like accurately sorting artists seems like would cost more than continuing open door policy, but that's just like off the top of my head.
No, man, I generally agree with like the points that you made there, and I'm totally aligned with that. And also, I think that talking about all this like diversification of musical touch points, I think we could also talk about how this is increasingly niche musical landscape.
Yeah,
where it's like there's just everything's, maybe because of the ability for us to sort of shape our playlists and like what we want to listen to and everything. It just, of course, yes, there's the algorithm and all that stuff, whatever, blah, blah, blah.
Increasingly niche like and increasingly atemporal. I think that's the other thing that scrambles songwriting stuff even more, which is like, so I'm a longtime fan of Numero Group, right? Who does in many ways the Lord's work of like reissuing, especially the soul reissue stuff, where they're like this label. If you don't know them, you should check them out. They do amazing like reissues of like various kind of long forgotten soul labels, and a bunch of other music too. But like, what's funny is after like following, like longtime subscriber and reader of the Numero Group newsletter, is like they get TikTok hits now, right? Like they're reissuing like weird and things pop up, and then like all of a sudden those compositions. I mean, the question of like how TikTok payout structures is a whole other question we're very much not getting into in this episode. But like the sense of that the atemporality of the musical landscape makes it again harder to understand how valuable a song composition is.
So there's literally it's actually there's more of an incentive to like keep that open door policy and keep these like, because you really can't tell now. There's so much like niche, there's so much like everything's so atemporal, it's happening so quickly. It's like you never know. You might as well just go ahead and like keep that open door.
Yeah, I mean,
like cast a wide net.
For me, I think maybe to wrap stuff up. For me, I want us to go back. I think to the initial ASCAP impulse, which I've been thinking about for many years, both like in this show and as part of my like academic research, and like that I've really come around to at some level, because if we think about all of this, especially this like large scale landscape stuff, as in some ways like sectoral negotiations, right? Like how are industries going to be sorted up? Who's going to own what? How are they going to be integrated? Totally. Yeah. How is the money going to flow? That actually, that initial ASCAP impulse of like, we're going to like semi-illegally like just demand money from other sectors.
Yeah.
Like is actually because at some level we know those sectors are as good as they are because of music, but the value chain simply can't be traced very effectively. And I would say that maybe the metrics now finally could potentially exist, but like there's so many layers of intentionally constructed opacity that is simply never going to happen, right? Like maybe if you were a social scientist, you could figure out how much economic value various elements of YouTube produce, but like you're never getting those numbers because what they don't want you to see is how much money like these companies are taking from these value streams. And so that sectoral shakedown approach is actually like kind of awesome, I think. Like restaurants, you're making money from our music, give us some. Like radio, you're making money from our music. How much money? We don't care. Give us some. Like that kind of like and clearly then how it filtered down was a deeply problematic process that cut all kinds of people out of the story. But I do think that at some level, like saying the music industry is its own thing, or maybe like this is my gut, right? I could be wrong, but this is my gut. That a world in which the music industry says we're musicians, we have these sets of practices, we have these sets of values, we have these sets of shared experiences. this is an industry and like we're demanding money for music rather than like the music industry as an element within a broader portfolio of other, tech, video streaming, social media, back in the day, a big radio company. Like when the music industry is self-defined and then it can take those like hard-nosed, like that hard-nosed combination of like lawyers and goons and go out and shake down other industries, like actually it pulls more money into music. And then whether that money is
really does.
Evenly distributed within music, which like, by the way,
Whole
it's not,
question.
whole other question,
Yeah.
but at least it's in the music ecosystem. And so like, I'm kind of into this like sectoral shakedown of the original ASCAP. And given that, I am concerned, and I think everyone should be concerned about, given the set of really important negotiations that are going to happen over the next decade or so throughout the creative industries, but I think that music is often a pretty intense bellwether. Given that, like, having a major player that could be part of the music industry, maybe not be like moving out of that orbit a little bit, like be part owned by Alphabet, be like a for-profit tech company vibes. Like that just strikes me as a development that makes that like we need to get ours mentality less likely and like potentially pulls a major leverage point for the expression of that mentality. Really against is the right word, against other industries, makes it harder to like generate.
You mean it makes it harder to actually like this sort of like we need to get ours like swagger mentality that maybe we see from like, Most Illustrated by like UMG probably, like you think it actually lessens it when now that it's like going private. Interesting. Yeah. That's super interesting. Yeah, I like that. I think that's a good point to end on, but I'll just I just want to say that I really do love this take because, we like to, I like to call him, I like to call him daddy, but, UMG boss, Lucian Grange, there is something kind of really, awesome about his, just like the way the UMG operates. And if you think about it, like, what's the one thing that probably in the last like 5-10 years that like songwriters and musicians complain the most about? And it's like Spotify, right? But who has like is casting a large shadow over like and can put the squeeze any fucking time they want on Spotify? Fucking Lucian Grange. And like UMG. I mean, am I wrong there? So I don't know. I kind of do like this point. It is kind of it's a bit of a funny point, but I do like that. But I will say to wrap up that the one thing we do know about this merger is that the very cash-strapped iHeartMedia is getting $100 million from it, which thank God, man, because, they really needed that money, right? Anyways, on that note, we'll wrap this up. Music by Bird Language. We have a newsletter, but we don't really don't write it, but we're going to pick it back up. Hopefully. We'll see. We'll see how it goes. Yeah, so subscribe. Substack, moneyfornothing.substack.com. And yeah, we'll catch you next time. Bye.